And thank you very much for both finding your way down a long, long path with many deviations that you managed, obviously. There may be people wandering around, who've fallen off into gardens in Oxford. My name is Jean Seaton, and I like the other things I do. I'm the director of the Orwell Prize, who's started this event, who's organised this event tonight. The Orwell Prize gives awards both for journalism, books and blogging, for those books and blogging that most meet George Orwell's ambition to make political writing into an art. But we also do much more, or very much less money, than most other literary prizes. We try and, in Orwell's name, I suppose, stir up argument, see if we can find where orthodoxies are lurking. And we are very, very pleased to see you all here tonight and to have a very interesting topic ahead of us. Orwell, I think, was very good at sniffing out orthodoxies. And the trouble with orthodoxies is that you don't really know that you hate a conventional way of thought. I mean, if there was a sort of a prize, you just actually often fall into herds. And it seems to me that freedom of speech is a very interesting area in which it's easy to talk about it, but you only know when you're kind of near it, when it hurts. It's the hurting bit, the uncomfortable bit, the disturbing bit that makes you know that you're actually in territory. Anyway, we are here because we are going to bring a whole week of events, some of which might help some of you do some revision they certainly did last year, to the Oxford Literary Festival. Including ones on Burma, and What's the BBC For, with David Mitchell in the spring. And so we thought we'd see some younger people who mostly go to the Oxford Literary Festival are interested in some arguments. Tonight we are extremely grateful to our panel. We're going to discuss, as it were, what can't you say in the 21st century. It seems to me something that is always moving. We've got that sort of panel. We've got Douglas Murray, who's the director of the Centre for Social Completion and who wrote a book, Neoconservatism Why We Need It, and who, in a sense, has been prepared to provoke all sorts of arguments. And that's what he likes. He likes to go out with provoke arguments, and we're very grateful and lucky, I think, to get him here tonight. We've got Mehdi Hasan, who is now the New Statesman's senior political editor, but he was the youngest, so you're on the youngest news and current affairs editor at Channel 4. And he's been part of the New Statesman, as it were, changing its views of things, changing all sorts of attitudes towards things. He's very much part of another reinvention of the New Statesman. And he's got to leave at 7 because he's got to go off and do a more maze. So Melanie Phillips is his next course. And Timothy Gartnash, you may actually need no introduction to. You may have read lots of him already in all sorts of places. Is one of those. Do come in. I feel like a lecturer, which of course I am. There's room at the front. He is one of those people who occupies. He's actually an Orwell Prize winner. It's a wonderful journalism, but he occupies that strange position between being a journalist and being academic. His most recent book is The Facts Are Subversive. Like me, he believes, unlike probably a lot of you, that there are things called objective facts. This is a very, very, very dangerous thing to do these days. And people do you over the head with French theorists till you blue in the face. But and Timothy has written a whole range of things that I'm sure you've read that have raised all sorts of issues about history and journalism. And the question is, what can't you speak about in the 21st century? We're going to have five-ish minutes from each of our panel, and then we're going to open it up to you. We'll go on to about 7:15. Thank you very much for coming. And I'm going to go with Douglas and then Timothy. So
can I remain seated?
You can. I only stood up because I'm so bossy.
Okay. Good. Thank you for the Orwell Prize. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for coming. What can't you speak about? Well, I suppose to honour Orwell, one ought to be exact. he was always that. I'm sure you know the story, but when Orwell received a bullet in his throat, just missed the crucial part of the esophagus. And was speaking to a friend afterwards, and he explained that this just grazed and missed the part of the windpipe would have left him dead. His friend said, "How lucky you've been." And Orwell said, "No, if I'd been lucky, I would have been shot in the throat." It's always important to be exact. So I suppose I should start by saying the following. Now, not very many things you simply cannot say. There are a lot of things, however, on the first tier that people think they can say and rather enjoy boasting about not being able to say. There's sort of people, for instance, who say, you know, gosh, call me terribly politically incorrect, but, and then come out with something very trite and obvious that risks nothing, but they like to pretend it does. Then there is a level of things that have absolutely no risk around them, but people like to think they're brave warriors by saying. Let me give you an example. The extraordinarily large number of idiots who in recent years have believed that by opposing, for instance, Dick Cheney, they encounter some kind of threat. By saying nasty things about George Bush, they're somehow being brave warriors, rather than saying something very, very obvious, easy to say, tedious, and often repeated. There was no threat to say you thought that the President of the United States was a moron for 8 years. I thought it was not true myself, but there was certainly no threat to saying it, but I always liked the sort of idea that some people who did that kind of thing gave out, which is they were sort of sitting in a bunker, fearful that Dick Cheney was going to knock on the door and shoot them like a lawyer. So there's that category, the pseudo difficult to say, which is actually orthodoxy. Then there are things that just are made difficult for you to say. Let me give an example. As people know, fellow panelists will know, the Press Complaints Commission is a fantastic body for pretty much demonstrating what Anacharsis' description of bad law is. And it's strong enough to detain the weak, but too weak to detain the strong. It's very good at tying you up in red tape and for somebody written into them so they found something you said offensive. The only appropriate response to which is, well, fuck you. I'm not bothered. You'd have no right not to be offended. And I'm annoyed that I have to write an explanation or go via a lawyer to explain why I didn't mean to hurt your feeling. The same Press Complaints Commission can do nothing serious about serious, really, really serious breaches of the law. But anyhow, there are, however, things that do detain you on this one. I was the subject of one of these the other day when I discovered a case which came up and which I wrote about in my site on the Telegraph, which was the case of a man who had gone to a local council meeting in Kent. He was a union representative for Unison, if you would like to make a complaint. He was at a council day, and a Conservative councillor in Medway in Kent had made the following appallingly bad joke. He said, an Irishman walks into a pub, he sees his friend defend an empty glass, and he says, would you like another? And the man says, why would I want another empty glass? Now, this is a very, very poor joke. That, as you know, Rowan Atkinson said, the only response to a bad joke is not to laugh, the only response to a good one is to laugh. The idea that the law should be involved in either is grotesque. However, this man claimed that he had Irish descent and found the joke very offensive, got thousands of pounds in compensation from the local council, and the councillor found guilty of saying this unfunny joke. And I said, this is grotesque. Our servicemen in Afghanistan bring home not much more than £1,000 a month to face incoming bullets from Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And this man got paid many more times that to face an incoming joke in Kent. And as a result, I said, well, why don't you they can't take us all, send in your Irish jokes. For which self-appointed loudmouth Irish busybodies complained to the police, and the Press Complaints Commission, and so on. So we've been tied up and irritating, apart from anything else, a week on Irish radio explaining that I don't actually hate Irish people, I just think you shouldn't be fined for saying bad jokes. Anyhow, this was an example of something that just is a sort of tediously, you're not meant to say this, but you sort of can. There are very few things, finally, therefore, which do cause a problem, or which are hard to say. I think quite a lot of journalists in Mehdi and Hasan would find it difficult to say certain things if they're reporting from Russia at the moment. Indeed, I know a lot of journalists who have problems saying certain things about Putin and the regime in Russia. Certainly if they want to keep travelling there and so on. And I think people do weigh this up. A Palestinian journalist friend of mine always tells a story of a journalist he knew who would once have written something rude about Arafat, and who this friend had to stop from being lynched in a bar in Ramallah some years ago, a decade after writing the article in question. There are places certainly where memories are long and people don't mind carrying out acts of retribution. But I think, to finish on, the biggest no-say of our time is, and somebody will know where I'm going, is about Islam. Because I take it as read that in a society where Elton John, for instance, can give another interview in which he sort of slips in, something about Jesus being gay, with a sort of obviously publicity seeking, and luckily people don't really forfeit, or at least they forfeit by writing articles about the fact that this is obviously publicity seeking. But no one's really offended, really, but everyone, there's still a degree of sort of, oh, I'm saying something naughty, aren't I bad? Well, I don't think anyone's going to come after Elton John. I think that people are fearful about saying things about Islam. I think they're very afraid of saying things about the facts around Islam, and non-Muslims and ex-Muslims in particular find it very difficult, and I'm sure I have the same sensation now as always happens when I say something is unsayable, as it were, which people get slightly concerned. But the fact is that for non-Muslims, Muhammad was a madman, or a lunatic, or a fraudster. These are the possibilities. But it is impossible that in the 7th century, in the middle of Arabia, an illiterate tradesman had bits of the Old and New Testament garbled to him by an archangel. It didn't happen. Obviously not. Obviously not. The other things that is also difficult to say about Islam are the fact that Muhammad, as a male adult, repeatedly raped a 9-year-old girl, his last wife Aisha. That is very difficult to say for a lot of people. And I know people, several good friends who to this day live under 24 hours security for saying exactly this thing. Last night I was debating Tariq Ramadan in London with my friend and colleague Fleming Rose, who still lives under protection, for publishing in his newspaper in Denmark cartoons of Muhammad. I still find it amazing that in 2010 this could be the case. I think it grotesque. In October, 2 men were arrested in Chicago for trying to kill Fleming again. And just last month, an axed man who had been sent from Al-Shabaab in Somalia came to ritually behead one of the cartoonists at his house in Copenhagen. I think this is a demonstration that it is deemed in this society, as in the Muslim world now, to be unsayable to say certain things that are perfectly obvious about Islam. I think we should say them. I don't think that means you always have to cause offence. But I think that people have to realise that by not expressing their opinions on this and other areas, any area, they make extremists stronger, they make our societal response to them weaker, and they do the worst thing of all, they censor themselves, and in the process they censor truth. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, Douglas. What can't you say in the 21st century? Quite a lot of things about quite a lot of people, countries, religions, institutions. I think there's a lot of things you can't say today. I don't think we realise how little we can say, either through official censorship or what is more pernicious, self-censorship, unconscious self-censorship. So I'm quite worried about the issue of free speech, and I do think there are real problems with our current society, with our current culture, in the media, etc. I should begin by saying that it's kind of banged into us from a very young age. We're restricted from childhood as to what we can and can't say. I have a 2-year-old child. I spent most of my time in the evenings, I don't see her during the day, to my wife's great complaint, who stays home with her, spend most of my time in the evening telling her off because she's done terrible too. So I have to say, if I say shit, you can't say shit, which is an argument she doesn't buy and my wife doesn't buy. But you know, since we're children, we're told you can say this, you can't say this. We go to school, teachers say you can say this, you can't say this. We get a job, our bosses say you can say this, you can't say this, etc., etc. And you know, that's rammed into us from a very young age. And so free speech is a very tricky issue. I don't know if I have a settled view on it, and anyone who knows me knows that I have a settled view on pretty much everything, apart from perhaps Northern Ireland, which I try and stay away from, and free speech, which is something that has, the debate around it has reared its head in recent years for all sorts of different reasons, rightly and wrongly. And it's something that I came along here tonight and I said to Jean, fascinating discussion, looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say, because I'm someone who takes each case as it comes. I'm someone who kind of, my views have evolved on this, depending on the climate. And I think Jean's right to say it's something that we only know about. We only feel when we've been harmed, when we're on the receiving end of someone else's harmful speech, or when our own speech is denied on a particular occasion. Suddenly we become great free speech advocates. I'm not an absolutist. It's become very fashionable in recent years to become absolutists on free speech. To be a moral absolutist is great. What was it that Bush and the neoconservatives said? Moral clarity is what we need. I don't agree with that at all. I think moral absolutism on free speech is a red herring. My good friend Johan Hari says that the solution to free speech is more free speech, and I think that's one of those, with respect to Johan, trite things that Douglas mentioned earlier. It's very easy to say, it's not practical, and it's not true necessarily. Even John Stuart Mill, as many of you I'm sure are great students here studying all those classic works, you know, he said something about, you know, you can feel free to slag off the corn dealer, but don't do it standing outside his house with an angry mob, etc., etc. We all accept that there are restrictions on free speech. Pure free speech exists nowhere on earth, nor should it exist anywhere on earth. Society would fall apart. We all accept the arguments for national security, for treason laws, for libel laws, to an extent, etc., etc. But within that space, it's getting the balance right. And what's happened in Britain today, and what I'm guessing, but I might be wrong, the panel will probably agree on, is that the balance is wrong. And that we now have a situation where it's tilted against where the line should be on free speech. Sadly, under a Labour government, which has passed 13 years of laws which have undermined basic rights to free speech. So that you are in a situation where there's some real grey areas and there's some black and white areas where we've gone wrong. Surprise, surprise, I don't agree with Douglas. I don't think Islam is one of those areas. I think it's laughable to argue that you can't say things about Islam. As someone who spends a great deal of time looking at the front pages of the Mail and the Express, I can only laugh and say that you can't say things about Islam. I thought Richard Littlejohn's entire salary was based on about Islam. This idea about the Prophet being a paedophile. I mean, it's one of your own traps. You say something brave and controversial, but Charles Moore beat you to it about 8 years ago in a column in the Daily Telegraph, where he called Prophet Muhammad a paedophile. Charles Moore still writes for the Telegraph and the Spectator, still a very well-respected journalist, is not living under any death threats, as far as I know. So I'm not sure that's the case, and we can talk about that more. What I do think is I agree with those old liberals at the UN. 18 months ago, the UN Committee on Human Rights published its report that it publishes every 3 years on human rights, in particular on free expression. And they highlighted 3 areas where they said there was a real chill on free speech in the UK. And one of them was libel laws, where we now are a centre for so-called libel tourism, where wealthy foreigners turn up to sue in our courts writers and speakers who they couldn't sue in their own countries. But our courts, they go with the plaintiffs. They highlighted the Official Secrets Act, which the government uses to crack down even on former civil servants who try and bring into the public domain genuinely important public information that we have a right to know. And the third area, of course, was anti-terror laws, where, for example, the provisions of the 2006 terrorism law were highlighted as being far too vague, far too sweeping, and which, where the government says, you know, if you're enthusiastic about terrorism, if you glorify terrorism, if you praise terrorism without defining these things properly, you are a terrorist, you can be prosecuted, you can get a 7-year jail sentence, I think. And this is a clear crackdown on free expression, and civil rights campaigners said at the time that free speech is one of the victims of the war on terror, and I wholly agree. So those are the 3 big areas that they highlighted. And I broadly agree with those areas. Of course, there are other issues about religion. There is a debate to be had about religion, about culture, about countries. What can you say about foreign countries? What can you say about race these days? What I would say before I finish is this, and that is that the free speech debate has unfortunately been hijacked by people with different political agendas. And that's across the spectrum. So when you hear someone talking about free speech, all I would advise you to say, as someone whose own view is not settled on this, when you hear someone, the purist, come along and say this or that, just check out what agenda they're coming with. Because everyone has an agenda. So I'll give you an example. You have the right, you have conservatives who say, free speech is gone in this country. Why can't I make that Irish joke I could make? Political correctness gone mad. What happened to an Englishman's right to free speech? If I'm Anne Winterton, I want to make a joke about cockle pickers dying, and I shouldn't be sacked to the Tory front bencher. Or when I was here 10 years ago, it was the ALCA, which I now believe is called OCA, the Oxford University Distance itself. But I remember them doing Nazi-style salutes and drinking games which involved singing about Nazis and Mercedes-Benz and all sorts of stuff. So that's the right saying, we have a right to do this, we have a right to free speech. But those same conservatives are the first to say, lock up those dastardly Pakistani kids in Luton who verbally abused our homecoming troops from Afghanistan. Lock them up. Same people. And there's a double standard there. Similarly, Muslims. I'll give an example from my own community. Many Muslims, I shouldn't make a sweeping statement, many Muslims say, for example, you shouldn't say anything bad about the Prophet of the Quran. You shouldn't say anything bad about our faith. We won't accept that. On the other hand, the same Muslims say we should have the right to free speech, to condemn homosexuality as evil, to condemn Christianity as a false religion. There's a clear double standard there. So in every group, whether you're on the left or the right, whether you're an atheist or a Muslim, there are agendas at play. And when people come to you and say X, Y, or Z about free speech, just check out the agenda that they are pushing before they make that very morally pure argument. That's what I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Timothy.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to stand up because otherwise I can't really think. It's a great pleasure to be here because I have to say the Orwell Prize is the thing I'm almost proudest in the world of having won, certainly having that name attached. And Jean has done absolutely a fantastic job of building it up, and George is proud of you, I'm sure. Now, I assume there are obviously many, many countries in the world where there are all sorts of things you can't say without being locked up by the state, like China or Burma or Saudi Arabia. I'm going to suggest we talk mainly about free countries, because that kind of narrows it down: Britain, Europe, North America, so on. And I want to suggest a distinction to you, to parse our title, which is what can't we speak about, and to parse it into three different things. First of all, what can't we speak about without being killed, or at least going in fear of being killed? Secondly, what may we not speak about without being prosecuted, or having a fear of being prosecuted by the law, i.e. what's forbidden by the law? And thirdly, what should we not speak about, even though we can and may? In other words, what we might agree among ourselves in a civilized debate in a certain context. Now, number one, what can't we speak about without being killed or going in fear of our lives? Here I have to say, I think Mehdi really understates the problem. Because there are now hundreds, possibly thousands, but certainly hundreds of people in free countries who live in fear of their lives because of things they said about Islam. It started in this country with the Rushdie affair. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Theo van Gogh was killed, the Danish cartoonist. It's quite a long list. And that is to say, the blackmail that goes, if you say that, we will kill you. And the chilling effect of that is much, much wider. Yes, Charles Moore, and yes, Richard Littlejohn, but the chilling effect, let me give you just one example. Here is a book just published by Princeton University Press by a very respected American academic called Jutta Klassen. It's called The Cartoons That Shook the World, the Danish cartoonist, right? The only thing is, you can't see the cartoons that shook the world, right? Which may seem a bit odd. She had a contract with Princeton Yale, to do the book with a reproduction of a page of the newspaper in which the cartoons appeared, plus some images of the Prophet Muhammad that appeared in historic Islamic art. Yale UP, a university press, reneged on that contract, citing fears about security. Now that, for me, is a pretty chilling example. And this, it seems to me, has to be resisted with all the vigour and determination at our disposal. And it's not just a matter of the law. It actually requires solidarity from all of us to resist that intimidation, which I'm afraid mainly does come at the moment from some Muslims. I don't say Islam, some Muslims, that has this chilling effect. It also, by the way, comes from the mafia, if you're a journalist writing about organised crime in Italy. It comes from some Sikhs, if you put on a play called Beheshti, which comes of riot. So let's not say it's only Muslims. But this absolutely, and it requires, you know, real civic courage and real solidarity. It's not just a matter of the law. Second category, what may we not say? Now, as you will all know, there are whole libraries in Oxford on this subject of the law on free speech, and we could go on for 15 hours just on the First Amendment, because everybody agrees, and maybe of course right, that free speech doesn't mean you can say everything everywhere about everybody. That's obvious. So, privacy, to some extent respected. Almost everybody in the world agrees that paedophilia, child pornography, should be controlled. I mean, that's an almost universal taboo. Incitement to violence, even in the great American First Amendment tradition. Incitement to violence, which in a famous court verdict makes the violence imminent, intended, and likely. Imminent, intended, and likely is bad. Okay? So I think we could all agree on that. We could have a conversation about sort of forms of speech, sometimes called hate speech, which might have the effect of inciting violence. I mean, there is a line to be drawn there. But what's happened in Britain and Europe over the last 20 years is that restrictions on free speech have gone far further than this. And I mean, maybe hinted at it. There's a security aspect, there's a life aspect. There's also restricting free speech in the name of respect for religion. Yes? You respect my taboo, I'll respect yours. Or respect for diversity. Or let me give you an even worse example in my view, which is legislating what you can or cannot say about the past, about history. Right? Which, are there some historians in the room? Yes. Think of that. So this, of course, starts, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, in Germany and Austria, with the criminalization of Holocaust denial, and then it spread. So that now, it is a crime in Switzerland to say that what happened to the Armenians in Turkey in 1915 was not a genocide, and it's a crime in Turkey to say that it was. Right? So, how absurd can you get? I do not think there should be any legislation about what we should say about the past events and dead persons, including Mohammed, Jesus, you name it. I think that is a clear case where we need to put back. So I think that restrictions by law on grounds other than the ones I've mentioned have gone far too far in Britain and Europe, and we actually need to push back quite a long way. This brings me to my third thing, which is what should we say? Because having a right to offend does not mean you have the duty to offend. That's clear. It doesn't mean we have to say insulting things to everybody and all. But as you know, speech is contextual. And one of the great difficulties of legislating this, apart from the ones I mentioned, is that something which is said in one context may be humorous, in another may be genuinely inciting to violence. Let me give you an example. I'm now going to say something rather shocking. I want to appeal to you to join me in trying to strangle Gene C. I'm now going to try and say, please join me, ladies and gentlemen, trying to strangle Gene C. Right?
I'd fight back.
You would find out. Now you may have detected that this was intended as a joke. But if you saw the transcript of this meeting and took that out of context, it could be construed as incitement to violence, right? So everything depends on the context. This is why comedians got so upset about the incitement to religious hatred and all that stuff, because half of good comedy is ethnic slurs. And actually the difference between a great Jewish joke and an anti-Semitic joke can sometimes be who's saying the joke. But it's not just comedians. So much of our communication, civilized communication, is about tone and situation and how it's said. And so what I believe passionately is in people living in a diverse society as well as we do, working out how to live with each other and how to speak to each other on their own. I believe passionately in self-regulation, in the sense of, for example, universities, working out what you can and cannot say on campus. Newspapers having their own codes of conduct, the BBC, individuals in their own lives. And the trouble with legislating that is that it ends up treating you like Mehdi treats his 2-year-old. It ends up treating you as kids, telling you what you can and cannot say, when you can and cannot say shit. To be a grown-up is to work out yourself when you are and are not going to say shit. And that's what I think we need to do. So in sum, I feel quite passionate. First of all, that there really is a challenge of violence, of people saying, if you say that, we will kill you. And we really need to fight back. And that does not mean saying this is Islam. It means these are some Muslims. Secondly, that the restrictions on free speech by law in Britain and Europe have gone far too far into doing things that the law should not do. And instead, we should work out ourselves how we want to speak to each other. And that's what it means to be grown up and to be a citizen.
Thank you. I think that was very helpful. I just wanted to ask a question which is related to Mehdi's question. And it's, I feel like the Durkheimian moment coming over me. I mean, one of the things one's looking at is, as it were, the conventions of being civilised and politeness. And in its, and actually you teach your daughter both in her interest, because to be a person is to be a polite person, actually, to have courtesy. And one of the odd things about the contemporary world is that the domain of courtesy is very challenged. So if you look at comment is free on the Guardian website. Yeah, I was with Andrew Brown, who runs the religious bit of the Guardian website, or even if it was unimportant and mean and was unchallenging, and you write something in the Guardian, it is rather startling, actually, the kind of response you get to people, from people very, very quickly, which calls into, almost immediately calls into account what you look like, what your gender is, what age you are, you know, who you were married to, you know, these very, very personally, no doubt how big I am. You know, I can't remember when you called me a fat cow, but I mean, you know, they would have done. And so it seems to me that the territory of courtesy has become challenged, and that one of the things we're looking at is that you can be very offensive to somebody, but courteously. And it's holding that line is one of the things that, for instance, the internet has made, so that you can be anonymously rude about somebody in a way that in this room you wouldn't be rude to me, because although I don't know your name, you're not anonymous, because we're in the same human space. And it's, I think one of the things that we're looking at across these things is where it is that one should be courteous, and what are the rules of courtesy, and where it is that you can really challenge ideas. And then beyond that, as I think your distinctions were extremely helpful, where courtesy's got nothing to do with it, because it's so so the response that you get back is so absolutist. So can we just talk about courtesy a bit? Because courtesy is a matter of, it seems to me, of habit and civilization. It's a Montaigne sort of issue, courtesy. Is courtesy in your... Where does courtesy fall?
Yeah, I would use a slightly different word. I use the word civility.
Yes.
Which I think is a broader, larger concept. One of the qualities of civil society is civility. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, British diplomats, when they're going to, when they start a sentence and they say, with great respect, you know they're going to say something very rude, an absolutely certain sign. But that's fine, you know. So with great respect, please. I actually largely disagree with you in the sense that, you know, let the anonymous bloggers rant. Let them rant. We will go elsewhere. We will go to another site. I mean, I don't think you can control the web in that sense. But if I'm the Guardian, and I'm concerned about the quality of conversation on my site, then I'll tell you what I would do. I will do what slavery is starting to do, which is to try and squeeze out anonymity. Because I think, and I know what New Statesman does, but anonymity, I think, is often the key. We
allow anonymity, and my colleague James is here. We take most of the abuse on the sites. You're lucky. All you've got is fat. We've got much worse. We get the abuse. The internet is the greatest invention of our lifetime, I believe, but it's also liberated every nutcase coward on the planet, on right and left. So, I mean, I take a slightly different line from Timothy. The problem with Timothy's argument, which he expressed so articulately before, is this idea of, and you mentioned religious expression, you said, let people say what they have to say. It's and dare I say it, we're here in Oxford, land of dreaming spires and towers and ivory towers. It's very theoretical. In the real world, it doesn't take into account the harm that is done to civil society. It doesn't take, it's all very well, for example, since everyone wants to talk about Islam, 2 million Muslims live in this country. It's all very well to say, everyone should have the right to say whatever we like about the Prophet, and we can argue that yes or no. Fine. But does anyone stop to say what the impact that is, what impact that has, that speech has, on the 2 million people who have those beliefs, who happen to be a minority and quite a weak minority in this country? And it's all very easy to say from our kind of ground here in Oxford University, sitting in our chairs, let us say what we have to say about faith, without taking into account how that translates to a 13-year-old kid on an estate in Bradford who gets on the end of that speech, which isn't being delivered by Professor Timothy Garton-Ash, but is being delivered by a skinhead from the English Defence League. And I think there's a big distinction there, and I don't think sometimes we in the media or in academia
But hang on a second, let's just take my free level. Are you arguing it should be banned by law, or that people should watch their words, watch their language?
Well,
that's really important.
Well, there is a law. Well, wait a minute. There is a law already in existence on religious hatred, which I assume you oppose, which the Labour government passed in 2006. Well, incitement to religious hatred.
Yeah, I mean, hang on a second. I mean, we're getting into detail. The law on incitement to religious hatred has actually been so successfully emasculated by the Liberals that I'm very much in favour of it. Right. But I wasn't in favour of the original law. Were you?
Well, I was sympathetic to the idea of the law, as you pointed out, again, the technicalities of the detail. Why? Because I see the BNP and Nick Griffin as a party which no longer goes around saying, you're a nigger, you're a kite, but they do go around saying Islam is evil, and they do use religion as a cover for their racism. And it's very easy to say, well, we're only talking about ideas, we're only talking about the Prophet in the 7th century. No, we're not. We're talking about actual human beings who live in our society and hold those beliefs very closely, and those beliefs are part of their identity.
But why the law? I mean, let me give you the counter-example. The United States is one of the most diverse societies in the world, in every which way. It has a great First Amendment tradition, so you can say what you like. People don't seem to be killing each other, the streets are not running with blood. Why? Because people have worked out for themselves how to live with each other.
It's not, well, first of all, it's not strictly true, you can say what you like in the United States, but that's a separate issue. But the United States is an interesting example.
Well, within the firm.
Well, Well, Douglas mentioned the example earlier of Dick Cheney. It was very brave to say anything about Dick Cheney and George Bush. They wouldn't come to get you. Not true. Children in America wore T-shirts to school saying George Bush is an idiot. They were expelled from school. FBI agents turned up at their house. So it's not true to say that Bush and Cheney didn't crack down on anti-war. Yes, I'm sure. Well, we live in the age of the internet. We're going to go right now.
If you advocated abortion in America, you might come in for.
For what? Not you wouldn't be prosecuted. You might come to death.
When I'm referring to anti-terror laws, which you glossed over, I mean that's the biggest for me. That's a much bigger issue.
The abortion is very interesting because it's often brought up by people as an example of, for instance, this type of fundamentalism in America. People often cite, abortion doctors that were under threat in America and so on. What is striking about this is I think in the last 20 years, about 9 abortion doctors have been targeted by anti-abortion people. And in each of those cases, the person who threatened and who can attack was taken to court by the state, prosecuted, put in prison. So it's already, there are, as you say, laws about incitement, there are laws that stop people doing harm to others. Now, on the religious hatred subject, this is very important. Because what was attempted in Parliament in 2006 was precisely to stop people saying what they think about religions, even when it's true. This is a very, very important thing to bear in mind. Even if you said something true that could have offended somebody of faith, that would be illegal. Truth, in other words, is no offence. I hope you know what a serious situation it is when the state would pass such a law. It is true that Muhammad didn't hear any voices, just as it is true, in my opinion, that Moses didn't come down from any mountain with any tablets, and also true, in my opinion, that it's less likely that Mary was the first person ever to become pregnant without the insertion of a male member, and more likely that a young Jewish girl told a fib. I think all of these things are obviously true. I think that if you didn't like the fact that I think that, we can have a discussion about that. But again, the idea that the law could get involved, when all three of these things seem perfectly obvious and true, I think is a problem. And a problem which Mehdi and others who have suggested such laws are a good thing have to consider.
Can I now open this? Thank you very much. Can I just open this out? And what I might do is take 3 or 4 questions and then come back to the panel and do it in that way. So if I can go 3 or 4 questions, one at the back, 2 at the back, 3, 4 at the back. Oh, 5. Were you 5? Okay. Yeah. In that order.
I think it's distinction making between different contexts where you might say, for example, marriage with people or whatever. But we're talking about when the law should get involved, and it seems to me that in the example you gave, on the say with this game and so on, it seems to me that the law could already get involved in there in a very simple way, which is that could, I haven't done laws since A-level, but it seems to me that could easily constitute assault. In similar situations, there would be...
I never mentioned
Assault doesn't require...
Well, assault doesn't require actual physical violence. I mean, it can be sort of the apprehension of immediate force, I think is the phrase. And it seems to me that you could very easily make a case for that in many situations where there's sort of where the context is like that.
I can't remember what I said to you. Oh, okay.
I wasn't next, but I did want to ask a question, and it was to bring attention to kind of Saeed's point about in Orientalism about power relations and the ability of the one party to define the other over and above that party's definition of itself. And I feel like on the discussion about Islam, this is part of the issue. I mean, we're almost talking about like an idealized public space in which everybody has equal access to participate in this discussion, and that just isn't the case. And so the ability of one party to define an other over and above itself is the issue here. It's not, in fact, about free speech. It's specifically about that point there, I think.
So then you should change the parallel. I mean, say that, for example, on comment is free, you have the whole gamut of British Muslim voices. All the different positions of British Muslim voices. They've made a lot of effort to do that.
They're pretty much the only ones, so
well, there's email and there's, you know, a few other names, right? Email, not email.
Oh, ML, yes,
yeah.
Which is what I used to work for, and they have an incredibly small readership and virtually no non-Muslim readership, and that's the point, really. How many people here have read ML magazine? How many people go out of their way to kind of make sure they hear?
Can I just can I just take the questions, because I said I would, and I can't remember what was number 3. Okay, 3.
I was wondering if you thought that commerce and the increasing institutionality in nations of multinational corporations has a restrictive influence on free speech.
Just about coming back to the civility question, but how much is being civil part of a cultural basis? So, for example, last year I lived in Russia, and it's kind of less of a cultural given that we would say, is in Britain, we would say thank you for holding the door. If we were in Russia, you just would. And then again, that translates into something like in France, where it's just not the done thing to talk about politicians' private lives, and that's kind of a self-censorship issue among politicians. So just generally about that as a cultural issue.
I accept that there can be problems with involving legislation of free speech. The thing about legislation is that it undergoes public debate, and you can write to your MP about it or the courts and clarify it. If we did as you suggested and left the onus on institutions to regulate themselves, what kind of public oversight can there be, to stop corporations and so forth from abusing this kind of power?
I just was wondering if we can get a little bit more from Timothy on his Hobbesian, let's say, fair approach to these laws. Is he in favour of the racial incitement law, if not a religious one? I assume he includes the Holocaust when he says he doesn't think the history book should be legislated about. And finally, what is his response to the BNP point that Mehdi raised? And sorry, very finally, can somebody, either Douglas or Timothy, tell me what about those cartoons that is so important? Given that they offend so many more people than they please, can somebody just, I mean this non-facetiously, but because I want to know the hate, what is it that is so crucial about those cartoons?
Can I answer that straight away? The reason was this, was that Fleming, the editor of Boston, just heard that there was a children's book publishing firm in Denmark who were intending to do a series of children's books about the major religions. And they had done on Christianity, on Buddhism, so on. And they discovered that the one for children about Islam, which, like the others, is an entirely offensive, description of the history of religion for children, that they couldn't find an illustrator who was willing to illustrate the book. And they went around quite a number, and they all said, one of them went to the president anonymously and said, yes, I was thinking of Taylor McGraw, the murdered filmmaker. And as a result of this, Jean Poston realised that there was already a self-censorship in Danish society, and that self-censorship like that ought clearly, and I agree with this, to be broken.
But Douglas, what you're not telling the audience is that they were part of that self-censorship. 2 years earlier, they were offered cartoons of the Christ, and they said, we're not going to publish this because it will offend Christians.
Maybe that's not true. That's not true. I'll tell you what happened with that. There was a cartoonist who went to Jean Poston 2 years earlier with a cartoon. The editor said, we do not think that our readers would appreciate this. But what he meant was, and they have published anti-Christian cartoons. In fact, Fleming bought one along last night. Nobody published ones before as well. But before the Muslim cartoons, they self-censored on Christian. No, they didn't. Let me just explain it back to you. What happened was that this man came with a cartoon. The response, the standard Russia response was, we don't think our readers appreciate this. This is because they decided it wasn't a good cartoon. It wasn't that because of its Christianity.
It's all the Muslim ones.
No. It wasn't because of its Christianity that they didn't include it, because they had included and have since Christian cartoons that Christians would find offensive. And this, well, the point is this, that once you've decided that there is something in your society you cannot say, once you decide that one religion can be ring-fenced from offence, can be protected and treated on a different level, I think you have a problem. And this is what Fleming and the others thought as well. It will be a problem if we treat Islam differently
So,
from
so,
every other thing.
do you campaign throughout Europe against Holocaust denial laws on the basis that Jews are getting special exemptions?
Let
Do
me
you?
explain it, yes.
For consistency?
Yes, I'm against Holocaust denial.
No, on those terms. Do you go to Holland and Germany and do you say, I'm against these laws because you're giving Jews special protection?
Yes, of course. This is
You use that phrase? Because you're saying it's like Muslims getting special exemption. You're obsessed with Muslims. All I'm saying is, do you use the same language for Jews? Is Holocaust denial associated with Jews in the same way that the cartoon? I don't have a problem with the cartoon, I'm a Muslim.
Yes, it is.
But
It
you
is
generalise about
yes,
Muslims.
No, I don't. I'm trying to talk about a specific case, if you're not interrupting me. No, you don't know the case. On Holocaust denial, the reason why Holocaust denial, why I'm spoken against it and written against it routinely, is yes, precisely because it gives one group an ownership of a part of history that cannot be touched, which I think is a problem. I think is a mistake. Apart from anything else, because as always happens, other groups notice it. When Sikhs rioted outside Bejti, I was against that because I also knew if other groups came on this, and they will, if they succeed this, other groups will come in. Lo and behold, Jerry Springer, the opera, more evangelical Christians on it. If you give people the idea that one group can have protected space, other groups will follow. Other groups will request the same thing. And we see this now with the Holocaust denial laws, with other groups wanting certain parts of their own history ring-fenced. The other thing is, of course, and just to bring on Timothy's point on this, and the point that Orwell made about this, is how much weaker it makes us as a society when we say there is something that cannot be said. And one of my favourite columns of Orwell's from Tribune in 1947 or 6, I think, is his description of what you would do if you met a flat earther. And he said, what mentally thinking about it, how would I do this? He said, I could probably do the horizon thing, and the ship sailing along it doesn't remain the same. I could do certain things, but how would I actually explain to somebody that I know the Earth to be round? And what would I do if I met somebody who said, it's not flat, but it's cone-shaped? All these things are different. The point I'm trying to make is, we weaken ourselves. He says, of course, he'd have to have the worst thing of all. He recognises that he would have to say at some point, I can't explain why the Earth is round, but I know a man who can. This is a very useful thought demonstration to do, and this is the problem with Holocaust denial laws, is that they make us as a society no less. And I think, by the way, if you speak to certainly the younger generation of scholars now on the Second World War and the Holocaust, I would say, and I hope it's not preemptive fuddy-duddery, that they are knowing less than some of their predecessors for precisely this reason. That if you ring-fence ideas, if you ring-fence things in history, you don't have to know as much. What will these people do against David Irving? David Irving will know more than them. Because they haven't had to rub against this, they haven't had to try it out, they've been ring-fenced from offence. This is a terrible, terrible...
Can I bring you in particularly on the question about the side, Orientalism, as it were?
Yeah, there were several questions.
Yes, there were.
On the cartoons, just read this book, because it's a complicated story. And actually what they went and said was, they said to all members of the Danish Newspapers Illustrators Union, there's a separate union, the Danish Newspaper Illustrators, there are 42 of them, draw me a Prophet Muhammad. And they produced all sorts of them, most of them bad in the sense of just bad cartoons, but they were very diverse. The issue for me is not whether that was a good or bad piece of journalism. The issue is not whether we should publish them. The issue is that the intimidation, the threats of murder, the fact that there are 80 people called Kurt Vestergaard in Denmark, which is the name of one of their cartoonists, and all 80, are living under some measure of police protection. That's the issue on the cartoon. On Holocaust denial, I am totally opposed to the criminalization of Holocaust denial. Totally opposed to it. And I think it's a really important point. The double standards point. We cannot say, we defend what is sacred to us, namely the memory of the Holocaust, but it's total free rein, open shooting, on what is most sacred to you. Then we absolutely cannot say that. Either we protect our taboo and you protect yours, or it's free-for-all. I'm for the free-for-all, okay? Within limits. This brings me to the two things. One, anti-terrorist laws, where I agree with you. I mean, I basically agree with you. I think they've gone far too far. I think it was absurd myself. I think Douglas might disagree to prosecute the so-called Liverpool terrorists. That doesn't fit my bill of genuine incitement to violence, right? So,
but on that point, don't you think, and this is what I'm worried, this is what I'm slightly concerned about this discussion, that the discussion is, and I'm not surprised it came down this way, but the discussion is about Islam, Muslims, religion. The discussion is not about government, state, military, which for me are the much bigger threats. We can talk, I condemn and abhor those of my co-religionists who threaten Danish cartoonists with violence. They need to get a life. And I condemn that mad Somali axeman who broke into the house recently. I remember reading it and thinking, what a nutcase. But, and I'm not apologising here, that is not the same thing as governments across the West, for example, cracking down in all sorts of different ways on, for example, on free speech. You haven't mentioned at all, Douglas, nobody in the audience mentioned that more people have been killed, more journalists have been killed in the last few years by the United States military than by any radical Muslim in war zones. Journalists have been killed now by armed forces, whether it's Sri Lanka, whether it's Israel, whether it's America. That's a much bigger threat to free speech. Journalists being killed by armed forces of free countries. Believe me, that's a much, much bigger issue, but no one talks about it.
Well, I mentioned that there's something dishonest in this, which is that, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but the British Army doesn't aim to shoot journalists. And the American Army doesn't seek the death of journalists.
Well, that's debatable.
Well,
when they bomb an Al Jazeera headquarters, they have the coordinates for beforehand twice, and when journalist unions around the world condemn it, it's very easy for you to laugh it off. Why don't you say that to the wife of the journalist?
Well, I'm perfectly happy to continue discussing this. I'm not speaking to anyone's wife about this. I'm discussing the following point, which is that, as far as I know, it is not British Army policy, maybe, to shoot journalists. What you seem to imply is something quite other than that. Now, people do get killed in war zones, that's true. And no one on this panel is arguing that they should. So I don't...
Well, no one on this panel is arguing cartoonists should be killed either.
But the intention matters, and the intention, when it comes to the people that we're talking about in relation to cartoons, is part of the problem. And not just of the individuals who do it, but of the, and you will not find a cleric, I would imagine, in Britain or America who would approve, for instance, or not fail to condemn such a killing. I think you find it very hard to. It is for some of us about the free speech debate in relation to Islam, one of the most troubling things is not just the very small minority who would carry out acts of violence, but the larger number of people, albeit still a minority, maybe, although the majority of certain clerics, who do not go out of their way, as they should, I think, to condemn such behaviour. Can I just pick up on one thing that Timothy said, which is in relation also to the, it comes back to the point about, that was raised about the trickle-down effect of freedom of speech, because somebody mentioned, and maybe mentioned, how this stuff, you know, we talk about this here, I may say something offensive here to Muslims, but how does this feel, as it were, if it trickles down in society, people who will do bad things, they might interpret it as it were, a license to say something horrible and objectionable to a vulnerable Muslim child. The truth is, you cannot police this process. Because once you decide there are things that cannot be said because a thug or an unpleasant person of any variety is going to pick it up and mistreat it, you go in a very bad direction. There are quite enough stupid bigots in the world who are willing to interpret anything as incitement to violence. But do you really want to start saying that our laws on freedom of speech for everyone will be decided by these people? I don't think they can be. And the final thing on this, when it comes to offence and to being offended on this is sadly something we simply have to deal with. Every day in my adult life, I feel offence. I feel offence when I open the garden. I feel offence when I open the newspaper. I feel offence when I turn on the television. I feel offence when I walk down the street. I feel offence when I see stupid people. I see offence when I meet very sensitive people. I have all sorts of things, a wide range of things in a day that offend me. But I do not believe that the way to stop that is for me or anyone who agrees with me to legislate that offence away. I said this when I reviewed Kenan Malik's pretty good book on the Fatwa al-Jihad about this, when a member of the Muslim Council of Britain, Najat Badlawala, said about the Rushdie case, he said, I didn't understand, genuinely, as a teenager in North England, I didn't understand with satanic verses why we were being singled out. And one of the tragedies that came across in that book is that nobody seems to have got it through to Najat Badlawala in the meantime, that the satanic verses was not a singling out of Muslims. It was treating Muslims in exactly the same way as every other group in society are treated, which is to say, you will have, in a free, pluralistic, multicultural society, you will have your opinions trodden upon, including your deepest opinions, on a fairly regular basis.
But if I to offend people on the basis of their race.
I wouldn't like to have laws that stop that. And for the
We do have
let me finish this point. If I may just finish this point, is that we have to be much better in society at explaining also to people who come to our society recently that having the right to be offended is one of the most fundamental rights we have, and that a society in which even your deepest, most deeply held convictions are trodden upon regularly are the only societies worth.
I think very briefly, a lot of this seems to be about where we draw the line. When you go back to first principles, why should we have freedom of speech from that principle, then do we draw the line to the problem?
Okay. Actually, my question is very similar. What's wrong with society saying, as a majority or as a group, these things are off limits? What's wrong with society taking ownership of the way it operates?
Well, I agree with you, Douglas, with your views on Moses and the Pentateuch and those things. I think you make a step when you say truth, and then you say, in my opinion, that's true.
Well, I was trying to be more polite.
Yes, no, I appreciate that, but it was still an opinion. I thought not true.
Anybody else want to just say something? Because I very much. Okay, you, then you.
Well, just in the interest of not confirming Saeed's point, it's worth stating that the main Muslim organisations in the UK continuously publish press releases stating their condemnation of terrorist attacks and all sorts of attacks, including the ones on the cartoonists in Denmark. And the fact that someone like Douglas, who actually, seems to focus primarily on the Muslim community, doesn't seem to be aware of these or refute or seems to ignore them, is actually a confirmation of my point, which is that Douglas is on a platform talking about how these things aren't happening. They are actually happening, but none of you are hearing about it, and that's the issue.
Can I pick up that very quickly?
No, you can't. I want to get the other
free speech has been denied.
I've just become a bit confused now about what offence is and what it means to be offended. Like walking down the street and being offended, I just don't understand how that compares to being offended. I just want clarification.
Anybody else just want to? Was there anybody else with their hand up? Okay, quickly.
Quickly, Holocaust denial. Timothy, he could have gone on to mention, I'm sure, is that the moment the Holocaust denial laws suddenly passed here, clerics and people like Ahmadinejad in Iran always says, look, there are holy things in Europe they cannot say. How come they are allowed to cartoon the Prophet Muhammad, but they ban things? See, they have holy things as well. It's a terrible, terrible rod for free society's backs. Secondly, the MCB, Muslim Council of Britain, one of the most senior members, Dawud Abdullah, signed the Istanbul Declaration that calls open attacks on anyone who supports or has ships in the area outside Gaza in helping the international blockade. That, I think, is a serious step for one of the heads of the biggest umbrella organisation that was in the UK to do.
You support the Israeli illegal bombing of Lebanon, so I mean this is ridiculous. I just think it's political view.
Well, no, because no, it's not irrelevant at all. We can have that debate back about, and I wouldn't expect you to agree with me on that. But I also wouldn't expect anyone to pass laws against it. But this comes on to one of the other things: is that if you start to pass laws, this is one of the reasons I think there's a problem with the race hate laws as well. Not because I think that people should go around saying racist things about each other, of course not. But I have to say, I'm not sure that it does make racists behave any better. I personally feel that if somebody is a racist, I'd rather I knew the fact I'd rather that I knew what they thought about me.
Yes.
Sorry, no, hang on. Okay, maybe I don't want to be let's try it another way. Let's try it another way. This ties in with what the lady here. This is what the lady here said about walking down the street. Look, I've used this example many times, but let me give it to you fast. If you're very fast. If you're a gay man like me and you walk down the streets of Britain hand in hand with your boyfriend, there are about 3 streets in Britain you will not get abused. I can guarantee it. It's much worse than a lot of the abuse that people talk about routinely as being offensive. Now, let me pick up on this. I don't think that people who shout certain things at me should be criminalised. And if they're bigoted homophobes, I want to know they are. And I'd much rather live in a society where I knew that than I cover them over and they hid behind me.
I want to bring in you, and then you...
Well, my point quickly is that when he calls you offence, can we hear someone else speak?
I'm going to sum up very quickly. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm not surprised, but I am disappointed that the entire debate is about Muslims and Islam, because in a sense, Timothy, I do think there are huge issues, as the UN has pointed out, about libel laws. The Culture Select Committee has just published a report today about the balance all being wrong in our libel laws. That rich people could come here and shut up novelists, journalists, editors. We don't hear anything about that. These are huge issues, anti-terror laws, locking up people on the basis of what they say. For example, in Luton recently, no matter how abusive. These are huge issues, and we don't talk about them. Instead, we talk about Muslims. And while I accept Timothy's point, that, and perhaps I'm happy to apologise or rephrase if you thought I was understating. Not at all. It's disgusting that Muslims threaten non-Muslims with violence, but at the same time, it's also disgusting that there is an entire cadre of journalists, columnists, who abuse Islam and Muslim every day freely without any death threats whatsoever, without any threats to their career, let alone death threats. And I just think we have to get everything in proportion. We have to get offence in proportion. This idea, you made the point of walking down the street, I think this is absurd, and to use your phrase, trite, to say that you're offended by what you read in The Guardian, and compare that to how Muslims felt about the cartoons and their attack on their prophet, who Muslims regard as more important. I love the prophet more than I love my own 2-year-old child. You'll never understand that. I don't expect you, that's fine. But to compare the two is nonsense, and it is trite, because the only valid point you've made tonight is that you as a gay man get homophobic abuse. And you're right, and you shouldn't. And the idea that you get it from The Guardian or The New Statesman is absurd. So this idea that you're offended by that, that's the only point you can make a legitimate point of. You cannot tell me that I don't mind racism. Sorry.
You have deeper feelings.
Yes, I do. On racism, I do have deeper feelings of Douglas. You're white, I'm brown, I'm the minority, we're the ones who suffer racism. I'm fed up of people telling me, it's fine to be racist. I want to hear what a racism is. I don't. Yes, you did. You said, I want to hear if someone is a racist. You said, well, those are your words.
Know if they're racist.
Yes, well, I don't. I'd rather they keep their racist views to themselves. I'm glad we live in a Britain now where racist people do keep their views to themselves, apart from the racists and the BNP who use religion as a cover, and that's a real problem, even if the religious law is not the right thing to do. There are huge problems in our society. It makes no sense, and it's you who are being dishonest to say it's all about Islam and Muslims.
Produce any rational... Right.
Can we go up?
Yes.
First of all, I do think it's really important to see the difference between race and religion. It's an absurd and offensive statement to say blackness is wrong or untrue. It's not absurd, although some may find it offensive, to say the claims of Islam are untrue and wrong. And so there is an absolutely fundamental difference between what we're saying about incitement to racial hatred and what we're saying about incitement to religious hatred. And everything we've done since the Enlightenment has been about enabling us. Everything we do in this university is enabling us to question the truth claims of any faith and none. Secondly...
Sorry, are you pro-racial hatred laws or what? Douglas is anti.
Right. So, how long do we have? I mean, Anthony Lester, who drafted with Roy Jenkins the wording of the incitement to racial hatred, has some problems with the particular legal wording, which is calculated to stir up, because it's a rather woolly wording. So I think there was a problem with the woolliness of the wording that invites a sort of cultural victim. But I have no problem in principle with laws on racial abuse, not least because I think they have led to violence in the sort of situations you're describing. And so we need longer on this. I think Douglas and I may disagree on that. Okay. By the way, I think I would want to say a word for embattled minorities, namely white professors in Oxford. You know, this idea that somehow everything one is saying here is just white professors in ivory towers and therefore is disqualified, is itself a form of prejudicial statement. It's turning it the other way around, actually. You know, our embattled minority.
With your guardian column.
Exactly, I mean, I take that. But what I do want to say to that, and let me just go sideways for a moment. Mehdi is of course right that there are lots of big threats to free speech, and I think we would all, and Douglas will not disagree with that, and we haven't talked about some of them, but Penn and Index on Censorship have just launched a massive campaign precisely about libel law and libel tourism. So you can't say we free speechers don't care about these things. We do. It's the biggest campaign they have going at the moment. By the way, you asked about corporations. Corporations, sure, they intimidate people. But there is a difference here, which is most of this happens using and exploiting the law and exploiting financial power. And it is, with respect, a different sort of argument. And it's the sort of argument we need to have, where we sit here and we say, what should the law be and what should the rules of civility be? And where, to the lady there, the Saeed lady, if I may call you that.
Hi, I'm the Saeed lady.
Look, I think the position of British Muslims, and I think Mehdi might agree with me, has really changed a lot in the last 20 years. I honestly don't think you can say that British Muslim voices are now significantly underrepresented, at least in the British liberal media. No. They're quite articulate and they represent quite different positions.
But also abuse against Islam and Muslims have exponentially increased in that sense.
Right, fair enough. But I mean, what we're getting to is a normal position where it's not self-appointed spokespeople of Muslims, as it might be the MCD, who arrogate themselves the right to speak for Muslims, like the BNP, saying we speak for the British. It's British Muslims, just as Muslim British citizens and Muslim journalists participating in this debate. So I actually think, and I'd be interested in what Douglas thinks on this, but he might even agree, I actually think that in this sense, in terms of the debate, where the debate is going, we're moving in the right direction in this country.
I'm going to stand up. I'd just like to thank you very much for coming. I'm sure there's all sorts of other things we could have talked about, and all sorts of things perhaps you felt weren't discussed. But I think that actually the panel have raised some problems. But I suppose I teach lots of international journalists and go around, and you know, we are very lucky. This is a very sort of precious thing, being able to have discussions about these things, and we are lucky. We are so lucky. That's what I mean, Phil. That, you know, I've never been tested. Nobody's ever actually, you know, my generation has never been tested about freedom of speech in the way that actually previous ones were. And I hope that you have found tonight at least interesting. I'm sure that you found something to disagree with, but I'd like to thank you. And I'd like to thank our panel.